Hey there, this is Jen T. Grace, founder of Publish Your Purpose, and I am here with Paul Wolfe today talking about the launch of your book, Human Beings First. How are you doing, Paul?
I'm good, good, Jen. It's so good to see you again. It's been a hot minute, and excited to chat with you about the book and kind of all things that we talk about in this conversation.
Yeah, it has been a hot minute because your book actually came out on March 8th for
Yes,
International Women's Day. So it's been a
yes.
couple of months that your book has been out. So it gives us kind of a different angle to have this conversation around because you have a little bit of data and things that have been happening. So I will definitely ask you some of those questions. But before we get too far, I would love for you to kind of just explain to everyone a little bit about who you are, what you do, and then also a little bit about your book.
Absolutely. So, in the 20-ish years leading up to January of 2022, I was a HR executive and chief HR officer, chief people officer at a bunch of different, mostly tech companies like Match.com. Condé Nast was a magazine publisher. And then for the last 8 years of my career, I was the chief HR officer at Indeed, the job search engine. And, managed through the pandemic. A lot of HR people have felt that. That was interesting. I mean, it was interesting for everybody, but HR people specifically, because we had no idea what was going on and had never lived through anything like that before. And it was during the pandemic that I knew I wanted to write some type of book, probably for the last few years. And it was during the pandemic that it started to kind of take shape in my head. And then I was lucky enough to meet a coach named Erin Weed, who Jen. And I went through her process called the Dig, which is great because it gets to your operating system, like the core of who you are and why you are who you are. And I walked out of those 2 days with her in Boulder, like knowing exactly what my book was about, and then decided to leave my full-time job, which my husband got a little concerned about for a brief minute. And so for the last year and a half now, I'm on my own. I'm a solopreneur, as I've learned I'm supposed to call myself, and really I'm a human first leadership advocate. And the book is about it's human beings first, practices for empathetic and expressive leadership. It really is about the fact that the one universal truth for all of us is that we're human beings first, before any title that we're given or that we give ourselves or that an organization gives us. And I think that leaders for a long time have been taught to be imposters through leadership seminars and classes. And there's nothing wrong with that. It was just this, you're supposed to know every answer, know everything. And you're never supposed to let your employees see you sweat. Yeah. And that's not true. And during the pandemic, for me, that became very true because I have OCD. I was diagnosed with it a long time ago. And during the pandemic, it started to rear its head in very different, ugly ways. And I was trying to, we were forced to work from home. I was leading an HR organization supporting 12,000 employees around the globe and dealing with my own mental health challenges. And so my focus now is, speaking, advising, workshops, whatever it is, working with HR organizations in companies, trying to talk about why the human first leadership approach is best for everybody and how to think about implementing that in your organization.
Yeah. And obviously, I'm partial because clearly we're the publisher behind this, but I love that it's human beings first, because I feel like there's so many leadership books that talk about all of the other aspects of leadership and almost just kind of, it's not even assumed that we're talking about human beings. Like that's not even like part of the conversation. It's a completely different conversation. So I'm curious, like what has been, because it has been out for a couple of months as I kind of just said a couple of minutes ago, but what has been, I guess, the immediate reception to folks? Because obviously, like you've had this thought leadership, you worked with Erin through the Dig process, which I cannot endorse and recommend enough. I've also gone
She's
through
amazing. The whole process is amazing.
Oh my God, Erin is incredible. I feel like she needs to be on everyone's team. But, there's something to be said about when you're kind of talking, not in a vacuum, but you're kind of like having these internal conversations where everyone's like, oh my God, Paul, yes, that makes sense. But now that it's like in the world and kind of taking on a life of its own, what's been the reception to this idea of human beings first?
It's interesting. I think, when you talk to HR people, they're like, yes. And so I was, and we were talking about this just before we went live. I was at a conference a couple of weeks ago. A venture capital company put it on, and it was an interesting audience because it was their chief HR officers from their portfolio companies. There's about 65. Yeah. It was the chief technology officers, the chief security officers, and the chief product officers. Yeah. So it was if I speak at a SHRM conference or an HR conference, typically it's a bunch of HR folks, which when you talk about this, they immediately like, oh my gosh, yes. Like, yeah. I want to read the book. Maybe I need to have you come into my organization to help. Sometimes it takes an outside voice in an organization to really like hit drive the nail home or the point home. But it was interesting when I just did a fireside chat. It wasn't even a keynote with the head of HR of the venture capital company. And we talked about the book, and we talked about working in the world of VC, because that world is, VC company comes in and invests typically for 5 to 6 years in hopes of IPO or a sale where they make a boatload of money. Like, that's their model.
Yeah.
And this VC, I have to say, does a very good job of supporting their portfolio companies. And so it was interesting, man. A bunch of the HR folks, and I had been at the conference for a couple of days, so I had met a bunch of the HR folks that I was talking to previous to, but the majority of people that wanted to come chat with me after the fireside chat were the technology, security, and product folks, which was I was happy about it, but I was not my bet. I had a bet with the HR org about who would respond well to the book. And it was, my book is, when I started working with my co-writer, Candy Cross is my co-writer. She is amazing. She should be on everybody's team as well.
Agreed.
My first meeting with her was like, so what's your process? Or like, what's your patented process for human first leadership? And I'm like, I wanted to keep it simple. It's the old acronym KISS, keep it simple, stupid.
Yeah.
Because, and what we got to in the book is really just emotions and behaviors that every human has. And every leader has, that you can just lean into. And some of them are scary, like vulnerability and empathy in certain ways. But that was my point. And a lot of the product and engineering and tech folks that came up and talked to me afterwards talked about, I never thought of it that way. I always thought I had to learn something. You don't have to learn anything to be a human first leader. And then there are a lot of real life examples in the book. And so there's this OCD example that I use in the book that is an extreme example of vulnerability. And I find through sharing like challenges, sharing more of yourself, you tend to make new and deeper connections.
Absolutely.
And there were at least, like, I'll call it, a third of the people that were chatting with me made a comment about an example, a personal example I used in the book or in my Q&A. And one of them was my challenge with OCD during the pandemic. And it was like, and it's so interesting. They're like, oh, I have OCD too. I appreciate you sharing that. Because mental health is, this conversation goes on in the US. And I think the pandemic has helped normalize it a bit, but it's still not a normal part of a conversation.
Yeah.
And so I find that in talking about the book, or people reading the book and then talking to me about it or giving a keynote, because I'm pretty transparent just in general, but really transparent in keynotes, that you make these connections with people who have a similar lived experience. And with something like a mental health challenge, it's hard. For a long time, my husband didn't understand what it was like. And recently, at least here in New York, there's been this ad for an OCD drug trial. But the ad is so good at explaining what goes on in the head of somebody with OCD. And I said to my husband, like, you've asked me, we've been together almost 30 years. I'm like, you've asked me for a long time what it's like. And I'm like, watch this commercial, because that's what it's like.
Wow.
And I think those of us with a lived experience like OCD, or you can death of a loved one, divorce, whatever. And I don't mean to, birth of a child, trying to get some positive stuff in there. Like, I think there's something about that shared lived experience, because you really truly understand and can empathize or sympathize or whatever the emotion needed. And so I found, there to be a really good reception to it, because it is, I think people, when they pick up a leadership book or an HR book, they think like, oh, I'm going to have to learn a new behavior. And there's nothing new in the book. It's just, here's how you can be vulnerable, and here's an example of it, and here's why it's important.
Yeah. A word I wrote down a few minutes ago was permission. Do you think, because to me, it feels like that there's a sense of you're granting others permission to lead in a way that feels organic and natural to them, rather than forcing themselves into some kind of structure? Does that seem fair?
Yeah, I do. And I go back to my comment about leadership classes, and like they taught you a way, like a templated way to be a good leader.
Yeah.
And I was at GE during Jack Welch. Like, I'm dating myself now. And I went to Crotonville, their storied like leadership university. And they were amazing classes. But when I look back on the leadership class, I'm like, it doesn't feel comfortable to me.
Yeah.
And so like, I have to be me. I mean, that's the only way that a team that reports to me, or that I work with, or peers that I work with, or a boss that I work with, is really going to be able to make a good connection with me, is when you start to understand the human. And it's so interesting, even as HR leaders, we always think about our employees as employees. And like, okay,
Mhm.
I have, when I was at Indeed, it's like I have 12,000 employees during the pandemic. That's my job to take care of.
Yeah.
And then it started like, I really have 12,000 human beings because we were
Mhm.
all on Zoom, similar to this Brady Bunch boxes.
Yeah.
And you'd see somebody's cat or a baby, or
Yeah.
I had a long conversation with the grandfather one day of one of our employees. And like, that's when it really hit me, is like,
Yeah.
I'm a human being before I'm a leader. You're a human being before you're a leader in a run a publishing organization.
Mhm.
And so I think we all have to figure out how to lead in a way that is comfortable and authentic for ourselves, not a templated
Mhm.
leadership facilitated way to do things.
Yeah. And then so the way that your book is framed, is this something that someone who is an HR leader, or maybe they're in a different department, like you were talking about before, whether it's product or IT or whatever it might be, is there that application where they can read this for themselves to say, okay, this is how I can be a better leader. And now it's also something that I can show others how to be a better leader as well.
Absolutely. Like when I was talking to your operations team about where to categorize my book, clearly HR was one of those places
Yeah.
because that's my pedigree and my experience.
Mhm.
I think any leader can read this. There's not a bunch of
Mhm.
HR speak in the book.
Yeah.
I try to be good with acronyms and spell them out.
Yeah.
But I honestly think if you think about it in the most kind of utopian or Anna-ish way, any human being could read this book and be a better human being.
Mhm.
It's not about, there's this this is not in the book, but there's this great quote that gets attributed to Walt Whitman a lot, but Walt never said it. It's be curious, not judgmental. And
Mm.
if we all as humans kind of took that and internalized it, and before we judged or reacted
Yeah.
to something somebody said or what somebody's wearing or what they sound like,
Mhm.
where are you from? Like, talk to me more
Mhm.
about kind of where you come from. Where's the accent from? I'd love to learn
Mhm.
more.
Mhm.
Or, I will dare say a political belief. And
Mhm.
politics are very polarizing in the US, but, just stop and like ask questions and
Mhm.
educate yourself and get to know something a little bit about this person. Now, if they're not open to it, it's not going to get
Yeah.
anywhere. But like, I think anybody really could read the book and think about how they could have a better relationship with a relative or a friend, or how they could work better with a coworker that may be different than them or have different views than them. So I
Mhm.
think, HR leaders, HR folks, leaders, really any human could
Yeah.
benefit from reading the book.
Yeah. And your lens is corporate, right? Like you had 12,000 employees that were your responsibility. That is a hefty job, right? That's a lot of people.
Yes. Yes.
But I would imagine that there's still an application to someone who's got 8 people on their team, or maybe they themselves are a solopreneur and they're looking to maybe hire that first employee and they want to make sure that they're approaching it in the right way.
Yeah, it could simply be a relationship between a leader and one leader and one employee, or one
Yeah.
leader and 12,000. It doesn't really make a difference.
Yeah.
I think it is my hope, when people read it, and some of the folks that have read it, that aren't in the HR space, that I know that have gotten it or bought it, or that I've given it to, have read it, and they're like, it's just good to be reminded
Mm.
of the fact that we are all humans and we all have lives going on while we're trying to play whatever role. It might be, you know, a coach to a little league team. It might be a
Mhm.
leader in an HR organization, or a leader, a CEO of a company, or whatever it may be. But we all, I think anyone reading it could benefit. Relationships could benefit from it. And so
Mhm.
it's, one-on-one, multiples, doesn't really, could even be about how you can give yourself more grace and
Yeah.
permission to be human. So
Yeah.
maybe just internal as well.
Yeah, which is incredible. I honestly feel like that alone can be such a relief for people, because I would imagine like even people just kind of stepping into a newer leadership role, maybe earlier in their career, where they just are kind of like assuming it has to be done a very specific way in order to be successful. I imagine that's still kind of there, because if I even look back to my early career, which is now 20 years ago, which seems wild but is, and going kind of in, I just remember how I felt like, and I started off in a corporation, how I felt so like I had to look a certain way, I had to dress a certain way, I had to act a certain way, and it felt so disingenuous. And then it took a couple of years where I'm like, what am I doing? Like, I don't know, like, where my whole identity has now been lost in just a very short period of time. But I feel like even now, 20 years later, that probably still happens to a lot of people in those settings, right?
Yeah, I think it does. I think I think, there are lots of organizations out there and there are lots of cultures within those organizations. There are some
Mm,
organizations who are still very, I'll use the word old school,
mhm,
Mad Men-esque, if you will.
mhm,
And so there is this perception of what a leader is. Like you've got to have every answer. You can, never let your team see you sweat. It's kind of like there's this ongoing debate about forced return to office, and there have been a bunch. I'm
mm,
very opinionated about this topic, but there are a bunch of articles like come out almost every day. And I was reading one yesterday, I think, at the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, and some of them, forced mandates are kind of like when I'd ask my mom growing up, well, why? And she'd be like, because I said so, and that's it.
yep,
And like that can be a leader as well. And then I think
yeah,
there's the other spectrum where there are organizations and leaders that create psychological safety for you to
mhm,
be comfortable being who you are, because what you talk about is imposter syndrome. Like when
mhm,
your corporate roles, it was either implied or said outright to you that you need to dress a certain way,
yep,
sound a certain way, be a certain way. And if that's
mhm,
not you,
yeah,
and like, does it make a difference? Like there was an executive I worked with, I will not name the company, who believed that employees performed better, if male employees performed better if they were
mhm,
wearing a collared shirt and long pants.
okay,
And
yeah,
I'm like, and these aren't client face. They're like not face
interesting.
to face going to
Uh-huh,
visit clients or even on Zoom. Like, I'll be honest with you, I'm wearing a nice shirt. I have a pair of shorts on, and flip flops on
yeah,
because all you can see is from my waist up.
yep,
And so, like, if I'm not out meeting clients or in a store interacting with
mhm,
clients,
mhm,
do I really perform better?
yeah,
His
yeah,
philosophy was they felt more professional and they sounded more professional. I'm like, but if I'm uncomfortable wearing that
yeah,
clothing and I'm more comfortable in a t-shirt and a pair of shorts in the summer or jeans or whatever,
mhm, mhm,
some clothing to cover your body, like, isn't the comfort going to give you more um, uh, influence,
mhm,
more just being more comfortable being
yeah,
yourself, you're going to perform better. And there's, I haven't found a study that talks about like what you're wearing and if you perform better or not, but it was this ongoing.
yeah,
And so I think there are lots of perceptions out there that leaders
yeah,
have to look a certain way. I mean, you can even get into it from a diversity, inclusion, and belonging perspective.
mhm,
Most of these leaders, CEOs that are making these forced return demands are
mhm,
white men.
mhm,
That is not a diverse, like, that's not looking at it from a
mm-mm,
diverse perspective. And
yeah,
so, I think leaders are either lulled into being an imposter or almost forced to be an imposter, and then you just don't feel right. Like we
yeah,
all, at some point where you've got to show up and pretend you're something that you're not,
mhm,
or whatever the case is. And it's hard. You've got to
yeah,
remember, like, oh, I can't slip back into that.
yeah,
I
yeah,
shouldn't use that word. I should use this word. Like, no, like,
mhm,
you are who you are, and that's the
well,
beauty of it, is we're all these individual intricate human beings,
yeah,
um, that show up in a way, and in the best way we show up as ourselves,
mhm,
and we do our best work and we're most
mhm,
comfortable. And so I think there is still that perception in the
yeah,
world, in the universe, that leaders are different. And
yeah,
they're paid more to lead. And
mhm,
I think that's another rub, is like, understand what you're getting into before you become a leader, because it's not all it's cracked up to be all the time. Some days it's
yeah,
wonderfully engaging and enlightening and just joyous, and seeing the light bulb go off on
mhm,
somebody's head who's been having a challenge with an issue at work, and then breaking through with your coaching to solve it.
yeah,
There are plenty of days that you're dealing with human beings, and like, human beings have different opinions, and you're not going to solve
yep,
every issue. So, and my hope is, with doing this work, there are other folks doing this work with HR leaders and companies that want to embrace kind of this way of thinking about their people
mhm,
and their organization, their humans in their organization, that we can start a bit of a movement to start to change things, hopefully
yeah.
for future generations, for the better.
Yeah, I love all of this because it really, and that's why the title is just so perfect, because it is such a fundamental, easy to understand thing, and you're giving a roadmap of how to kind of just get back into the original default wiring of who we are as people.
Absolutely. Just be who you are.
It's so simple, so simple. I think it was Oscar Wilde who said, Be yourself because everyone else is already taken. I think that was an Oscar Wilde quote,
I'm going to use
right?
that
Like,
one now too,
right,
along with my Walt Whitman
um,
quote.
might wanna, fact check that, but
Okay, I'll check it.
it's
Yeah,
something similar to that, but yes, because it's one of my favorite quotes because I think so often and I think about that with authorship, right? If I try to give you guidance on what being an author looks like and how to show up on a stage and do all the things that you're doing, but I'm mirroring that based on what's working for somebody else, it misses the point entirely, right?
yeah, it does. Like it's interesting because I have this wonderful brand and marketing team that I work with, and they get the fact I am me. Like
Mhm.
they have other author speakers in the HR space, and we're different. I know some of them were just different,
Yeah.
and they're comfortable just embracing like and they've for me they've created a brand and a website, and they worked on my book cover and things
Mhm.
like that that makes me feel comfortable and
Mhm.
proud of the fact that this is my book cover, this is my book, this is my website, this is the
Mhm.
brand that I have, and it's I don't mean to dig at anybody, but there are lots of CHROs that are just want to be perceived as professional all the time. And
Mhm.
that's great. I am professional. Like
Mhm.
I did it for 20 plus years
Yeah.
and was good at it and I'm still good at it. But I also like simplicity and I like to
Mhm.
have a good time. Like in
Mhm.
life in general, like if I'm
Yeah.
not having a good time, then I gotta, you
Yeah.
know, figure something out because we don't know how long we get to be here on the big blue spinning
Mhm.
marble.
Mhm.
And so I just like that they got me, and it's different. Like if you look at my site compared to another, HR
Mhm.
influencer or former CHR or current CHR
Yeah.
who's written a book and out there talking. There's this difference, but to your point, and the Oscar Wilde, which I will fact check quote, I'm the only one that's me, so
Yeah.
I'm going to be me, and I'm going to own
Mhm.
it, and it is what it is.
Because I think from just a general marketing principle is this idea that everyone's like, attract the right people, right? Like we focus all this time and energy on finding the right people. But what we don't talk about enough, which is equally as important, is repelling the wrong people.
Yeah.
And the way we repel the wrong people is by showing up as ourselves, right?
Yes.
Inherently, there are things about me that will turn someone off that might want to engage with you instead, or vice versa. So if we're both competing for the same thing, doing the same thing, someone's going to be attracted to something else for whatever reason, and they're going to be repelled by something else. And that is a good thing. And I feel like we kind of like lose sight of that sometimes.
Well, it's interesting you say that because Indeed was a recruiting company and that was part of my job. But I always used to say to hiring managers, like, the worst thing to happen when you're interviewing a candidate and you end up hiring that candidate is if they're on your team, or I would always say this if I was interviewing like a director of marketing as a
Mhm.
finalist because somebody wanted another opinion. I was transparent. I'm always transparent in interviews. And so I'm
Mhm.
going to tell you why I work for the company and why I
Mhm.
believe in the mission. But I'm also going to tell you that not everything's perfect here because
Yeah.
let's be realistic. Nothing's perfect in life.
Mhm.
And like, here's the good and the bad. Like the bad's not so bad. Like to me, the equations always be the pros have to outweigh the cons. And as
Mhm.
long as that equation still works without a
Yeah.
negative result, then it's okay. But you have to be an adult about it and roll with it.
Yeah.
But what you don't want to do is in any type of relationship is like do smoke and mirrors,
Yeah.
do the interview and have them accept, and then have them realize you're not who you profess to be in the interview process,
Yeah.
or the company's not what it professed to be.
Mhm.
And then they're angry.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
like that's not going to turn out well. And that's an employment relationship. Think about dating. Think about,
Mhm.
any type of
Mhm.
relationship.
Yeah.
Like it's just easier to be yourself, and somebody's either going to accept you for who you are or they're not.
Mhm.
And so I think you're right. Like we'll attract the right people who we're going to work best with.
Mhm.
And that's not to say it's more of, group think. It's, I want people that think differently, but that we're going to
Mhm.
be able to think differently together
Yeah.
and create a better end result, whatever that, product or program is.
Yeah.
And so like, I think that's the right way to do things
Mhm.
versus, smoke and mirrors. And at some point the smoke and mirrors have to stop.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's gonna cost a lot more money to fix the problem than
Yes.
if you were just honest to start with.
And think about it's a lost relationship, and maybe it's one
Yeah.
you don't care about, but like, do you? I don't know. I want to go through life, and I don't necessarily want people to hate me, and I don't want to hate people, and that's a strong
Mhm.
word. But like, I'm not going to get along with everybody, but I want to respect the fact that everybody is a
Mhm.
human at
Mhm.
the end of the day and has a right to their opinion or
Yeah.
how they want to go through life.
Yeah. Yeah. Again, it's back to being human beings first.
Yeah.
Everything comes right back to that exact point. So What's interesting is that as we're talking about all these things, thinking about you as a speaker. So I know that you are out there, you're speaking, you're advising, you've got workshops, you're working on kind of some online curriculum that's going to be, kind of it's in the works. It's interesting because I feel like if I look at all of the marketing, the branding that you've done, even your book packaging, when you sent your signed copies for us as a team, I was like, I love the tape. Like it's such a simple thing, but just the way that the boxes are taped, it matches the water bottle that I know that you have sitting on your desk, for example. Like it all, like everything is cohesive and matches, and it's fantastic. Or like your website, or even in your email signature, everything just has this cohesion. And so, but it also has a fun vibe to it. So, and even your shirt right now, like there's just like a fun vibe to it. And you were just kind of saying that for you as a human, if you're not having fun, like what's the point basically? So I think of you as like a speaker and the opportunities that you're getting, and looking at you in a lineup of other speakers that are talking about similar things, and how it could be one of those easy selling points to be like, hey, this is the person that at least is going to come in and we're going to have like an engaging conversation, a fun conversation, still impactful, but it's going to be a different take on maybe a topic that has been very boringly spoke about by others for a very long time.
Yeah, I appreciate all of that. My branding and marketing team is a company called Individual I. It's individual.com. They're phenomenal, and but part of they do this brand. It's a PBA, personal brand assessment, when you first start with them. And I started working with them almost a year ago. And I remember, kind of answering, it's a Google Doc, and then we go into this like 2 hour, like, kind of session where they kind of dig more out of me. And I kept coming back to, look, I want people to perceive that I'm an expert because I've been doing this for a quarter of a century. And so I do have a vast amount of experience. So that's my, reason that, one reason you should think about hiring me to speak or advise or whatever the case may be. But I also don't want people, there's a lot of HR stuff and leadership stuff that, you can watch it online, sit in a class, whatever it is. And like, I could fall asleep during this stuff because it's just, it's good information, but it's presented in a way that just doesn't like keep me engaged and entertained and pique my interest. And so I kept, going back to simple. I like simplicity. Leadership is hard enough. People don't need to learn something new. This is all stuff that they already know. They know how to do. They just have to get comfortable with it, which goes back to being your authentic self and comfort in general. And I said, I also want to have a good time while I'm doing this. Like I want them to have a good time. I think about, whether it be offsite meetings that I attended or seminars or conferences. And, you learn something from, you're going to try and learn something from any of that stuff. But I find those that I remember, and I remember more of the content, are those that I had a really good time while I was taking part in them. And so that's how I said to them, like, it's got to be, there's expertise here and professionalism, and there's something interesting to talk about, but we're going to have a good time while we do it. And they did a phenomenal job. The book cover, it's a hand, with human beings first in it. I got on camera there, which I loved. It was the only cover design they presented to me, because the minute I saw it, and it's nothing, I'm not a creative person, and it's nothing I would have thought of, but I'm like, oh my God, like it took me a minute it was just black and white, and it took me a minute to realize it was a hand. But then it's like I started to show it to people. I think it was you or Bailey on your team at the time, like, oh my God, I love the hand. I'm like, okay. And I didn't say anything. I'm like, okay, they got it. Like that was the thing. And then we talked about the website. And so, yes, my water bottle, these are called Hoodles, camera shot there. They're human doodles. And this gets to, kind of the avatar portion is the same, the round head and the, half round body, but then each one is individualized to represent individualism as a human being, because we're all we're all different. Where nobody else, we're the human, nobody else is us. To colors on the website, to the book packaging, was a little bit of me and a little bit of them. I'm like, I've never been a big yellow person, and they put me in a yellow jacket for my author shot. And I'm like, I kind of like it's just a bright, energetic, like fun color. And so the book comes in yellow tissue paper with a nice little sticker on it, and we've got a human beings first sticker on the box, and we've got Hoodle tape to tape the box. But there's something to me about, I like the seamlessness of the experience, whether you're buying a book, soon to be able to buy merchandise, because we just went through and approved merchandise designs yesterday, so that's coming in a month or so, or you're on my website, or you're at a workshop that I'm doing, or it's something that I'm speaking at, you're going to feel similarity through all of those things, which I think is, from a brand perspective, important. And it doesn't feel disjointed, and it feels and it feels very comfortable to me. It's who
Mhm.
I am.
Yeah. And it's just executed so beautifully because I
There,
think it's perfect because
that's
like
all
if
them.
right, like if you were to send your book blindly to, to someone that you want to have them hire you speak and they see the whole packaging, like just the entirety of the packaging, they're going to be like, I have a feeling of what this person's personality is going to be like
Yeah.
just based on
And
the
the
packaging.
experience with
Yes.
me from them is going to be very seamless throughout
Correct. Which
the
is what makes it
process.
incredible. Yeah, I think that's what makes
Thank
the
you.
whole thing work. So I love it. I love all of this. Thank you so much for this conversation. I feel like it's inspiring for other authors to kind of see what you're up to and what your process is. And I'm hopeful that there's a lot of people who are watching this as well who are like, huh, all right, I like this idea of human beings first. Like, let me go check out the book. So the book,
Go check it out. The last plug. So I appreciate
yeah,
you and your team. I will say to everybody watching and everybody who may watch this, Jen and the folks at Publish Your Purpose
mm,
are flipping amazing.
thank you.
As a first time author, I didn't know what I didn't know when I walked into this. And there were, I got surprised along the way, but surprised in a good way. And I would ping somebody, either Jen or somebody on the team, like, hey, didn't know, like, can you help? Sure, I've got a Google Doc for that. I have like
Mhm.
the pricing worksheet that was shared with me, the ROI calculator. I'm
Yeah,
like, oh my God, this is great. I use it all the
love
time
it.
when I'm pricing bulk orders or an
Mhm.
individual, like, small bulk order for signed copies or whatever the case
Yeah.
may be, to figure out what the best, discount I can give them and how I can still make some revenue. So I cannot thank you and your team enough and tell anybody out there who's thinking about
Mm.
publishing their first, second, third, fifth, 10th, 20th book, like, you should talk to Jen and her team because they are amazing.
Thank you for saying all that, because if we could clone you and
It's
work with
all true.
100 of you any day of the week, I would sign me up. You are
Right.
a dream to work with.
Candy and I have started to talk about an idea for a second book. So I
I
may
love
ping
it.
you. I got to get through all of this, but like, I
Yes.
may ping you in a year or so.
Yes, one step at a time for sure.
Absolutely.
So your book is available on wherever books are sold. So Amazon, obviously it's there. I'm a big fan of bookshop.org because they have a commitment to small independent
Yes.
bookstores. So definitely do that. Is the book available on your website for purchase anywhere?
Yes. Paul
It
Wolfe
is.
and eontheend.com. You can buy it there as well.
Perfect. All right. And that is always my preference, is go directly to Paul. It just makes the experience. Then you'll get the
You
full
get the full
experience
experience.
versus going to Amazon where you'll just get it in,
Yeah.
Amazon's typical packaging. So
Yeah.
thank you so much, Paul. I really appreciate this. And I look forward to chatting with you again soon.
Thanks, Jen. I appreciate you and the
Yeah.
team. Like I said, have a good one.
You too.